Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. I'm very excited about tonight's show, but before I get into that, I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his wonderful intro. You can find him at nativestorytellers.com. It's an amazing site. Please check it out. So tonight, Mark Eddy has an amazing guest. He has the author of Stepping Out of Eden, Dr. Rita Louise. She's somebody that I have followed as far as her career for quite a while, and have found that she is full of all sorts of insights and wisdoms, sprinkled with a sense of humor and certainly a sense of knowingness that is really quite profound for today. So let me bring Mark on first. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. How's everything with you and in New England after the Red Sox championship?
Well, I happen to be a Yankee fan, so I stopped watching for quite a while back. It's really, if fall is here, I'm not sure we're going to get the color that we once did, but it just doesn't seem to be coloring up as much as it usually does. I'm very excited about Dr. Rita being on. Freudian slip there. She's somebody that I have admired greatly, and she has certainly a longer career in radio than I do. And
she's a documentary filmmaker.
Wisdom. Yeah.
You two have that in common?
Yeah. That's true. I do have secrets. You're right. But she has always been, I don't want to put her too high on a pedestal, but she's always been someone that I have hoped that my career would, to a degree, follow the success that hers has certainly manifested. I'm quite behind her as far as achievements, but, while there's breath, there's hope. So do you want to give her an intro, and I'll bring her on?
Yeah, it's her first appearance on Nightlight's long overdue, but we're changing that tonight. And I think Dr. Rita is the world's best-known gamma wave emitter.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Her website is soulhealer.com. As we go through the show, find out, Dr. Rita is a pioneer in internet radio, leading researcher with UFOs, ETs, other topics in the paranormal genre. You already discussed that she's also a documentary filmmaker, and we'll touch on icon deconstructing the archetypes of the ancients. She's also earned her doctorate in natural health counseling. Her website is soulhealer.com. But that's the stuff the public she wants the public to know, her real biography is that both of us appear in Ancient American magazine number 115. So order a copy. Wayne needs to get some cardio carrying a bunch of orders to the post office, and you'll see where the center folds.
Oh,
so,
wow. Okay. Well, let me bring her on.
Okay.
Hey, Mark. Hey, Barbara. Barbara,
hey there.
Great introduction. I'm loving you even more, and especially because you're a Yankee fan and not a Red Sox fan. Go Yankees!
Oh, God, yes. Sorry. Since Derek Jeter, so 25 going on 30 years.
All right, totally off topic, but my mom has this cutout cardboard stand-up thing of Derek Jeter in her room. She's that diehard of a Yankee fan. So.
All right, I haven't gone that far.
She got it for her birthday, so yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That is cool.
So,
Mark, you there?
Oh yeah. I'm just letting you two chat.
Well, she's got so much information. I mean, I haven't read yet Stepping Out of Eden, but I definitely, it's on my book list, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to tonight, too, because the two of you have a lot of stuff in common.
Stepping Out of Eden is a good one, and let's just start off the discussion with a quote from a book. On page 135, you can see where she wrote, "Just about every aspect of a ritual, when done correctly or with feeling, supports internal cleansing." So hopefully, by midnight, everyone will just feel healed, cleansed, uplifted, have a good feeling about tonight's show. So I think that was a meaningful quote you had in your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. So,
and I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just starting to ramble on about something else, and just like in the characteristic Dr. Rita fashion, you get us to think about ourselves, our behavior, societal norms, but what are these behaviors based on? How far back in antiquity are we modeling our behaviors, and on whom? So you get us thinking.
I seem to have that bad effect on a lot of people. And one of the comments that I've gotten, from this book and then my last book, E.T. Chronicles, was, but you don't provide any conclusion. And my feeling is it's not for me to provide the reader a conclusion. It's me to provide the reader with information and data and, I'll say facts, quote unquote, for them to come to a conclusion on their own as to what resonates with them, what doesn't resonate with them, what they think is true or not. Because there are a lot of talking heads out there that will tell you a conclusion, and then people run around and say, well, this is a fact, when it's not necessarily true. I mean, it's not a fact. It might be an assumption, it might be a hypothesis, it might be a speculation, but it's not necessarily a fact. Well, and I try to be pretty clear in separating the two.
You do make that point very clear in your book. The Columbus era people said the Earth is flat, and that was considered a fact. But now that we know more about the world, we can see that was really, more of just a theory at the time. It wasn't a fact.
Mhm. Well, I mean, and the same thing, and okay, some would argue, that the pyramids were built to be burial chambers, and we have been told that over and over and over again, but there really hasn't been any evidence produced to conclusively say that that was what their function was. And so what we run around with thinking is a fact is really speculation on somebody's part somewhere in time. And I think it's important for people to separate that part out, that there's not conclusive proof. And even with the whole, the earth is flat, I mean, it's the 21st century, and we have people that are flat earth theory people that are contending that the earth truly is flat.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and you do provide us with lots of facts, data from respected sources. It's all, you do a great job of documenting all of your information. So I'm just looking forward to learning more of your, the information you culled from different sources and presenting it to us. I think Stepping Out of Eden is a really interesting book. Start off with I think starting off with the ancients being very much aware of the topography, geography, their environments. You give some the evidence from Australia. How was such a distantly remote island from Asia or Africa populated? They have stories about how they got to such a distantly located place.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just stare and look at how knowledgeable the ancients were with understanding their world.
Well, I mean, one of the things that, how do I want to phrase this, we're coming to recognize, might be the best way to say this, is that, in antiquity, people were very much connected to the land. They were very much connected to their environment. They were connected to, what was going on, and not just from a five-dimensional sense of the word, but I think from, like a six-dimensional sense of the word, that they were in tune with what was going on around them. So in more contemporary vernacular, it was kind of like the level of intuition or psychic abilities was just much higher because there was more appreciation for that. But speaking to what you were bringing up, there is a scientist that was in Australia and was looking at myths of different Australian groups. And one of the stories that they told was about, well, the one in particular that I quote in the book was from this one indigenous culture that said that, well, you see that island over there? Well, at one point in time in our history, we were able to walk over to that area and we would hunt emu and, do all of this stuff on the land. And then one day the seas came rushing in, and ever since that time, it's been an island. And I think this really speaks to okay, so when we, I write really a lot about myth and our mythic history. And a lot of people say, well, they're just made up stories, they're not really based in fact. Then they say, well, the telephone game, which is you say a sentence into the ear of one person, and by the time it gets around a circle, the story is completely different. And they say, well, the telephone game, so you can't really hold it as being true. And so what the scientist did was he got a geologist, and between the two of them, one of the things that they came to recognize was that at a point in the history of that population, they were able to walk across that land and get to that hill on the other side, and eventually the waters did come rushing in. And when they identified where this change in the geographic area occurred was 10,000 years ago. So there was this group of indigenous people, first people in Australia that had transmitted pretty correctly a story about their history that was 10,000 years old. And it's interesting because after... Oh, go ahead.
No, isn't it true that almost with every myth there is a seed of accurate truth, and that a lot of times the myth is just woven around it as a story to keep reminding the generations to come of something?
I think that there are a lot of myths that are that way. I think that I think that myth started as facts, really deep in our history. And then as time moved forward, and I'm going to say, and this is in quotes, civilization started to happen, even in very primitive early ways, that they became a little more dogmatized, and other story narratives maybe came in that were a little bit more man-made. But I think that when we, really look at our very ancient myths, that they were definitely based in fact. Even though, it makes it so that you can remember, because these are stories that you grew up on, and ones that you hear over and over again. And, and it tells them who they are and where they came from and what their history is. And so for the Australians to be able to tell a story that has been dated to 10,000 years old, and then fairly recently there was an article I saw on Facebook about it was a tribe that was in Alaska, and they claimed that the populations that came from Asia actually lived on this island, and they actually came across from Asia, by sea, and traveled by sea, down the coast, and scientists poo-pooed them, completely poo-pooed them. That is until recently, where they started doing digs on this island to basically prove true or false these hereditary stories of, the first people coming to the Americas, and they found remnants of extended stays and cultures that went back 13,000 years. And so the legends that they had about their people arriving at this island and living on this island actually showed to be true, dating back 13,000 years. So it is possible, even though many people don't want to believe it, that we can hold pieces of our history intact through a very specifically oral tradition. Because we seem to think history only started when we started writing, and that we didn't have any history before, or we weren't able to retain our history from prior to the advent of writing. But these two finds show that we were very capable of doing that and passing it down in relatively intact to future generations, which I think is great.
and people say, like the Viking bards had to know, these stories of the battle and everyone's weapons. You can't change a word. They had to memorize it to be very accurately. People are also saying that even like a lot of native histories and folklore and mythologies were really didn't change over thousands of years. I mean, you find that all around the world is people held on to their traditions, without very little change for a long time.
Mhm. Some of the stories that you're talking about that the bards would share, and it's not just the bards, but you see this in many cultures, is that the stories were preserved in lyrical verse, so they were sang, or there was some, I'm going to say, melodic, poetic verse to them, so that they were easier to remember. I like to take things that, we find around us and kind of bring it into the present so that we can see parallels today. And I joke around because I would think anybody in the United States knows the words to Jingle Bells, even though we only sing that song, at a certain time of the year, but we've heard it over and over. And, okay, we might not know the second or third verse, but we know the first, we know the chorus, or what goes on at Big Mac, or what happened on Gilligan's Island. We retain this stuff because it's been repeated and repeated and repeated. And then they go, okay, but that's not really proving the point. And it's like, but what about the bards using that term? That was their job. It was their job to remember these things. And if you, again, take that job and bring it into contemporary times, I think everyone has heard a cover band that will play anything from AC/DC to Journey to Led Zeppelin, and if you give them $20, I'm sure they'd play you anything you want, and they know how to play the music, and they know all the words to the songs, including the second and third verse. Which takes a lot to do, but if it's your job, it's just part of what you do. So I think we find where people are still able to have that facility and capability today, but now we have books, we have the internet, so we have our cell phones, so we're no longer required to remember our friends' phone numbers. I mean, I can't even remember my cell phone number because I never call myself, and I don't really give it away. I don't give that number out. And so it's kind of like we've lost that ability to, just pick up the phone and dial it because we just look them up in our directory and, hit the call button. But I remember growing up, you had a list of phone numbers in your head. I can remember the phone number of the house, when I was at, 5 or 6 years old. I can still remember that phone number.
Mhm. Good examples. Yeah, it's just another example of, as Barbara and I keep talking with more people, find out, some things have changed. A lot of things just haven't, and just find the same pattern going on around the world. But you also got me thinking about the early stages of stepping out of Eden. You also got me thinking about like the different kinds of creationists. I think I'm kind of like the fall into the category, what you say is like the old Earth creationist, and I think the Earth is older than like the was the Usher, Usher or whatever.
James Usher.
Is where he came up with the if you add up the ages of all the people mentioned in the Bible and go back a little, to Adam, he was able to figure out that the world's only 6,000 years old, and it was created on a Sunday, and
that's one of my favorite lines.
I don't really buy that.
I added the Sunday part, Mark. I'll just say I added the Sunday.
Okay.
God rested on Saturday. That's the Sabbath. So obviously creation had to start on Sunday.
Okay.
Just saying.
There we go. I'm not really into that, but there's, I think all the creation started, a long time ago, but there is some kind of source behind it, and I think that's what help me to realize what kind of category I fell into, and some of the other different types of creationist thinking, the progressive. It's just another example of how you get people to think about what you're writing. The purpose of your book is getting you to think, and then there's also the idea, linked to that, the creation and evolution ideas is, Darwin's theories. There we are, back to the theories versus fact. There's, Darwin had some points that were kind of accurate, but so is the Bible. So it's not one or the other. So can you tell us a little bit about where you're coming from as you lay the foundations for stepping out of Eden and where you take it down the road?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, contemporary science claims that we evolved from a simpler life form to a more complex, so from one-celled animals into who we are today, or whatever animal that would happen to be. And then when you look at the hominids species, or hominids, that we evolved from apes into being humans through a series of gradual steps and genetic mutations that over a period of time created a new species. And so that is the generally accepted scientific view of how we came into being, And so, again, one of the things that I really look at with my material is the notion of, is there truth in myth? And if there is truth in myth, what do the myths tell us about who we are? And, so when you read myths, so actually I need to back this up a little bit, and so when people think of creationists, they believe that God created the earth, as you were saying, according to the James Usher timeline, in 4004 BC, and I think it was like October something, and then, of course, my adding, it was a Sunday. And so, and so that is, your basic creationist concept. Now, there are some that take into account scientific theories that the earth is much older, and they believe that God created the world, kind of according to the biblical text, and that there were many different acts of creation that occurred over this process of, 4.5 billion years. And then there's a third group that suggests that the earth is very old and God intervened with these various acts of creation over the period of time, and that in between those times that a species would evolve, but it wouldn't evolve into another species. So like a horse over time was not going to evolve into, something else, and that, but a horse could evolve from being little to being big, but it would still be the same species. And so all of the species were actually created by God. And then you have a third group, which are the ancient astronaut people, who believe that humanity or everything was created, through the intervention of extraterrestrials into the affairs here on Earth. And I joke around because the difference between a creationist and an ancient alien theorist is who and what they think God is. Where creationists, it's based on Christian concepts, and so they believe in a divine omnipotent God, where ancient alien people think that these gods are not divine omnipotent beings that underscore the universe, but are actually extraterrestrials that had advanced technology that intervened in the progression on Earth. So kind of with that foundation, one of the things that is abundantly clear when evaluating the mythic record is that there are no stories of a gradual advancement and shifting of animals from, one phase to the next phase. All of the stories talk about God created it, period. And so, if you look at that mythic base, it seems, they don't talk about evolution. They don't talk about a gradual change from one thing to another. They just say God created it, period.
Right.
And so it kind of makes me laugh because, ancient alien theorists and creationists actually have a lot in common, except for their definition of who and what God is.
Okay, and since you were just talking about ET engineering, and we have already touched upon theories versus facts. You do bring out the FOXP2 gene, which the Neanderthal people had it, but chimps didn't. So, okay, there's not a smooth jump from one species to the other according to evolution. So, okay, how do we account for this difference that is found in this gene?
Mm-hmm. And we see stuff like that all over the place, not just in human lineages, but in the plant kingdom as well. And we can come back to that if you want. But in human lineages, one of the things that we find are these big gaps, So, and I don't have my data in front of me, but the FOXP2 gene is tied to language and our ability to vocalize. And so that gene, I think every animal has that gene. and it lay undisturbed for millions of years. And then if for some reason there was a mutation that occurred in that gene which gave our early ancestors, so we're talking about like Homo erectus, Neanderthals, back in those days, the ability to vocalize and communicate verbally. But then another shift happened in that gene as well, and it's interesting because it seems like there was a need, if you kind of look at it from an extraterrestrial intervention perspective, that there was a need, that they had a need for us to be able to communicate with them better. And so they made this gene shift. One of the things that scientists can't explain is how some of these changes happened virtually overnight with no lead up to these changes. It's just like, boom, it's there, within populations, and very quickly, the change from like Australopithecus, which was our first upright ancestor, to Homo erectus, which, was vastly different, not just physically, but they had culture, they had lost their body hair, they were able to communicate verbally, they were able to utilize fire, they had advanced stone tools. I mean, there were a lot of changes that happened, but this whole giant series of changes happened in less than 3 million years, which, according to the theory of evolution, shouldn't be possible, because they're able to, like, statistically figure out how much mutation should be able to occur over a period of time, and they can't explain how so many changes happen so quickly with such a positive outcome for them.
Right. So, since it's brought up, what could account for these sudden and dramatic changes in humans. Another scientific fact you bring up is the case of Victor, one of the feral children that were studied, and I'm working down towards modeling our behaviors. So that's kind of, so if you wanted to talk about Victor briefly and just kind of start tying things together.
Sure. So, one of the things that I go into a lot of depth in Stepping Out of Eden is what makes humans be human. And I'm a little bit of a Trekkie, so there are like Star Trek references in the book, sorry. But I think most people have seen Star Trek and know generically the different characters in the shows. And so when you watch those shows, it's like a Klingon acts Klingon, and they go around, it's a good day to die, and they have this cultural heritage that is very Klingon versus the Vulcans, who are intellectual and they're emotionless, and so, it's part of their cultural identity, where humans don't act like Klingons or Romulans. But humans, as a species, we all kind of act the same. We all have the same set of base morals, regardless of where you go on the planet, it's like it is thought of as, and I'm going to say a sin, for lack of a better word, to kill or to steal or to, there's this whole set of morality that humans have, and expect from other people in society. Not that we're necessarily all that good at it, but it is just part of what it is seen as being human. And so, the question I asked in the book, or asked myself as, when I write, it's like I might have an idea of kind of what I want to do, and then I just kind of start asking myself questions. Well, but what about this? But what about this? So if there is this inherent part in us of what it is to be human, how did we get there? And so I spend a lot of time talking about that. But where it gets interesting, and there aren't very many cases, is with what is called feral children. And so feral children are children who are somehow separated and isolated from human interaction. And so the most significant case was this boy who was named Victor, who, when they found him, he was like 12 years old, and there were some hunters in the woods, and they just found this boy who was like jumping on animals and picking it up and eating them, and and so they finally got him to come into town with them, and he went and was living with this doctor who was trying to acculturate him to humanity. He couldn't speak. He didn't know how to use silverware, didn't wear clothes. I mean, the list goes on and on, because he lived like an animal in the jungle, because there had been no contact with humanity, so he didn't learn the rules of humanity. And, and after working with Victor for a really long time, they discovered that the window for acculturating him had really passed, and so he learned a few things but never was able to rejoin society. And I think over the years, since they've started documenting these cases, there have been 100 cases of feral children. And actually, there was a video or a documentary that was made about feral children, like this one girl who was kept with the dogs, in the yard, and lived in a doghouse, and so she acted like a dog because that was where her contact was. And so what it led me to believe was that, being human isn't just an inherent part of us. So we get a dog, we get a puppy, and the puppy is separated from its parents, so from the other dogs, and it comes into our house, and it still acts like a puppy, and then it's up to us to train the puppy however it is, but it still acts like a dog, and it still has its inherent nature. But with humans, in these cases, what we discover is that if you take a human baby and separate it from other humans, it does not develop into what we would consider human. I don't really know what you would call it, but it doesn't, we don't come complete with social values. We don't come complete with morals in the same way. We don't come complete with an ability to understand all of the nuances that society requires us to know and understand. Don't put your elbows on the table. Things that we just think are normal and second nature to this is what you do in society, but it turns out, or it appears that many, if not most, of the traits that make us human are actually taught to us, that we learned them at some point in time in our development. And it would be very interesting, although highly unethical, to do an experiment, where you would take a child away from its parents and allow it to grow up on its own, whatever. But it would be terrible to do. So we have to rely on these cases of when it does happen, to have the opportunity to observe what it's like when a human is not brought up and raised inside of the societal constructs that we have. And so, and we see some variations, like, the difference between being brought up in America or being brought up in China. There are some cultural differences that we see as far as, what the social norms are. But for the most part, we're pretty much the same.
And maybe some, one of the interesting aspects of stepping out of the Eden is, may bring up, the cargo cults, some of the body modification, body painting, facial masks, and how you give us these dates. A lot of this stuff just goes back to almost like the time of Göbekli Tepe, when that was built, or even before then, on cave walls. So one of the intriguing aspects of your book is like, so what are these behaviors based on? Blood, the cultural mores about touching blood or of an animal, or feasting. So what are some of the, we have to be modeling our behaviors and being taught by someone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, it's interesting because many of the things. So, I'm going to kind of create a little foundation here. So when I go and wrote this book, I did the same thing in ET Chronicles. This is kind of one of my little soapbox things, is that when I look at things, what I'm looking for are global parallels, and so, for example, in China, they have the practice of foot binding, where they will actually wrap the foot, and as it grows, it's not able to expand, and then they end up with these really tiny little feet. But when you look around the globe, you only find that tradition in China, versus some of the body modifications, elongated head, circumcision, tattooing. You find that on every continent, which says that there's some deeper level or much more ancient tradition tied to it. And so, my feeling is that, these things were told to us. Why? On a couple of different levels. You brought up about, touching blood or interacting with blood. It's kind of like, why would we come up on a global level that there is something inherently, I'm going to say sacred, with blood that requires us to ritually purify in order to remove, and I'm going to use the word taboo, from us? And it's not just having to do with menstrual blood, which I think many people are familiar with the concept that, there was a taboo tied to it. But it had to do with slaying an animal. It had to do with, like tattooing or, any kind of body piercing, there might be blood tied to that procedure. So there was a whole taboo tied to that interaction with that bodily fluid. In many cultures, blood was seen as being divine. So it wasn't, it's interesting because menstrual blood, for some reason, at some point in time, shifted and appears to have gotten a very bad rap. And I think the shift happened when the cultures went from being matriarchal in nature to patriarchal in nature, where it became dirty. Where in any other culture, when you're talking about blood, it's seen as a divine fluid, and something that was divine was also seen as being taboo, that you weren't supposed to touch it. Where taboo meaning not that it was necessarily bad, but that there was a prohibition tied to it. So it could be prohibited because it's like too good, like you're not good enough to touch it, or it could be because it's bad. So like the king or the god king wasn't supposed to be touched because it was taboo. Or, I think a common story that people would recognize is, Moses climbed to the top of Mount Sinai and he took his shoes off because he was going to be stepping on holy ground. And so that ground was taboo because it was holy ground. And, and so this concept of these items being sacred or, not good, we find everywhere, and there's a consistency to it. Body modifications, we find a consistency to the things that were done, and if you experience the taboo, we find a consistency to what needs to be done in order to not be taboo. But if you think about it, who came up with this stuff? One of the things that I talk about, especially in the body modification area, is, did a group of guys sit around a campfire one day and decide, well, hey, let's, just mutilate ourselves, and put bands on our children's head so we can stretch them out and have them be in pain for the first 3 years of our lives? Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, it's counterintuitive that anybody would do that for fun, or for a fashion statement, because I don't get the impression that back in those days that people did things, especially like that, for fashion. There was something much more practical, much more implicit. We know from some cultures, the Aztec, for example, that the king or the god king would either pierce his tongue or pierce his genitals in order to produce blood, because that was considered the most sacred blood, the blood of the god king. And so, but there was this huge ritualistic tie to what was going on. It wasn't that they were just, like piercing their tongue. There was a method to their madness, even though from today's perspective, we don't really understand what that was about. But for them, there was a very specific purpose. But again, who made it up? And the only but when you look at the mythic record, we're told over and over and over again, regardless of the culture, is that the gods told us what they wanted in order to be worshipped. So the impression that I get was not that we decided to tattoo ourselves and circumcise ourselves and crush the heads of our children, but that at some point in time it was an edict from the gods. And then over time it became tradition and perhaps became dogmatized and just became something that you did, and the true meaning of it kind of has gotten lost through time, although you can kind of piece together parts of it. If you look at a broad enough spectrum of cultures, and everyone is saying very similar things about, well, this is why we do it, you can glean some information as to the real reason why we started a tradition in the first place.
Yeah, and you do bring up some of the early god kings, like the Oan, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the fish teachers, and the Book of Enoch's the Watchers. These otherworldly teachers. And you make a lot of use of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So there's like three some of the earliest stories are document these teachers who had these capabilities of teaching the people the art, these kind of arts.
Mm-hmm. And it's very consistent. I mean, I joke around and say that humanity, based on the mythic record, seems like a pretty dumb lot, because there aren't any stories of, Fred discovered fire, or, Mary Sue discovered agriculture. It's always the gods taught us, or the gods gave us. They gave us fire. They gave us agriculture. They gave us metallurgy. They gave us knowledge of the plants we could eat versus the ones we shouldn't eat. One of a very early story that comes out of Australia is that the gods gave them digging sticks. Okay, digging sticks. And they would use the digging sticks in order to dig up roots, like yams, and I'm going to say potatoes, but I don't know if they have potatoes in Australia. I know they have yams.
Rutabagas?
Maybe it could happen. Parsnips. But, that story suggests, just on its face value, that prior to being given the digging sticks, they only ate things that came from bushes and trees, and it was like a giant aha moment that they could take this stick and dig up these root-based plants and then cook them and eat them. I mean, today we sit there and go, well, yeah, but apparently at one point in time in our history, we didn't have that knowledge. But the gods gave us the digging sticks and taught us what roots we could eat.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that really interesting, and I feel like when you hear stories like that, it kind of dates it. And then some of it, there are a number of references that talk about, what plants are good for medicinal purposes. You hear
right.
that, like what foods are good to eat, what ones you shouldn't eat, what ones are good for medicinal purposes. And one of the things that there was a burial, and actually it was a Neanderthal burial, just outside of Shinar Cave. And one of the things that they discovered with this burial, so there were actually a number of different things that occurred. One, it was the first identified intentional burials. Okay, because this individual was laying on his side. He was in a flexed, kind of like a fetal position. The body had been covered with ochre, so there was ochre on top of the bones. And one of the things that they found in this burial as well was the pollen of a number of different plants. And so when they analyzed the plants that he was buried with, it turns out that all of them had medicinal properties. And so they weren't necessarily there because they smelled good or looked good, but they were herbs. And so it's been suggested that this person might have been a medicine man, or some kind of shaman, healer, whatever word you want to put with that, that understood the use of herbs for healing. And so when he died, they buried him, with these ritual offerings, so to help him into the afterworld. But where, to me, it gets interesting is that this burial is 90,000 years old. And so it suggests that our understanding of medicinal plants goes back perhaps that far. We think that a lot of this stuff is new, and it's not.
Yeah, and the herbs in that burial sound like they had some kind of cultural significance, as well as pertain to his job during life. It's just really fascinating that you gave us that example, and Barb has an example of the giants in a cave. I don't know if she wants to get into that
Wait,
later.
are you talking about the Nevada ones?
The cave in Germany that you.
Oh, Brighton Wiener Cave, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's another. Dr. Rita has several examples of all this. The cave paintings and burials, deep within the cave, and then just in the at the mouth of the cave, like this shaman she's talking about. I mean, we're finding all these really fascinating facts about cultural rituals done in caves. I was just you two have that in common. I was just trying to think of Barbara wants to bring in her little giants in for tie it in. I don't know.
My little giants? No, on my
they're
website.
Big giants.
Yeah, I've got a ton of information on giants on my website, but he's talking about a cave in Britain, Winter, Bavaria, and in 1530-something, the townspeople, 25 of the townspeople, had heard about this cave, went up and investigated it, and found all sorts of mummies and bones like crazy, and they were frightened, and so they all left, and then they wrote a letter of report to the town council, I guess, and that letter is there now. It's available now, and the site where it is was used during World War II as a concentration camp for British and United States officers, and then later on made into a United Nations site. And Patrick had a friend who was there with the UN people, and they went in to see. They'd heard about the cave. They were worried that the bones in there were of the U.S. refugees, and not refugees, prisoners. And their thought was, if we can gather enough bones, we can have DNA done so that people can be notified. And when they got in the cave, it had been it was destroyed, but the cave was still there, and there were millions of bones. There were places where it was 5 feet deep with bones, and nobody's ever done anything to it. And at the moment that Danny was in the cave, it was in a site that was where they were doing live fire, so that the military and the UN didn't care if they destroyed this historical place. And it's just a little upsetting to think that our country is that disrespectful of things they don't understand.
Well, you would have to admit that, giants existed. And, there might be something that exists outside of the box, and so maybe they just wanted it to go away because it was just one of those anomalies that are just pesky and they don't want to have to deal with. I mean, like the Göbekli Tepe, to me, is a perfect example. I think if they could make that site go away, they would be happy because it is just such an outlier, on the basic concept of human development and human civilization. They can't explain it, and they don't want to, and they don't want to provide cogent explanation or, they just don't want to deal with it. I don't even know how else to say that because it doesn't fit, and so.
Well, wasn't Göbekli Tepe buried?
It was buried.
It was deliberately buried.
About 8,000 BC. Mm-hmm.
And what's amazing is the carvings on those stones have dinosaurs and all sorts of amazing animals that you would not suspect would be there, but there they are.
And some are extinct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they say that it was built 12,000 BC, but they don't really know that. They know the burial time because there have been remains, and flint work and things that they were able to date. And so they have a reasonably good dating of when it was buried, but they really don't know when it was built in the first place. But it takes the whole date. It takes the whole dating thing and throws, well, what about Stonehenge? What about Sacsayhuaman? What about the pyramids? It makes those potentially be outliers as well, even though we package them very neatly into the timeline.
Well, a lot of them, at Göbekli, they're T-shaped. Do you have any idea as to what the T-shape was for, or what it did? The purpose of the fact that they're T-shapes? Not really. Some people have suggested that they were designed that way in order to better support a roof. Which, okay. Maybe.
And that's possible. It's definitely possible. But we don't really know for sure. And we probably will never know for sure.
Probably not.
And so, and I know Mark knows this, but I'll just share it. I wrote an article about why Göbekli Tepe was buried. Because people have said, well, it was buried for future generations. It was buried so it wouldn't get destroyed. A few different reasons as to why they would bury it. And so in my article, I suggested that they buried Göbekli Tepe because the land was sacred, as if there was someone very, 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 very important that lived there. And based on the rules of taboo, because when, we didn't have laws, until, or the word law, and so, moral conduct was based on a series of what we call taboos. And, that if that land, so one of the things about that concept is that if something was too sacred, then it was taboo. So touching the God King, taboo. You weren't supposed to do it. You couldn't touch his personal property. If the God King walked across the ground, that land now became taboo, which is why many cultures would carry the God King on a litter. Because if he stepped on the ground, then regular people like you and me would no longer be able to utilize that space. And so if that site was indeed taboo because it belonged to the God King, then nobody else could use it. So, and this is just total conjecture and speculation on my part, but just to make a very strong point. So if that territory, that complex was used by a group of extraterrestrials, a.k.a. the gods, it would be an extremely sacred site. And it would be a site that no mere mortals could go to. And so what better way, because if a site is taboo, you can't use the stones, you can't use the rocks, you can't use the sticks, because everything in the site is sacred. And so if you take a stone, it's kind of like a virus. If you take a stone and put it into a different building, now the new building you just constructed is now taboo because it carries, the energy or whatever from the other site. And so what a better way to prohibit the population for generations to come from accidentally coming in contact with something taboo, but to bury it. And I don't know. To me, it seems like a very cogent theory, or at least a possible theory.
Makes sense.
I mean, it makes sense to me, and it actually makes a lot of sense to a handful of people. But, I'm not Graham Hancock or, one of them people, so obviously it can't be true. It's like, well, they just made their thing up too, so come on, leave me alone.
True.
I mean, I think it sounds better than they buried it for future generations. I think that's the lamest thing I've ever heard. I mean, that thing's 16 acres. It's huge. You don't just bury stuff because, our great-great-great-grandchildren might want to see it. Seriously? Doesn't make sense to me.
No, my thought was that quite possibly they were being raided, or there were armies coming at them, and they buried the site to hide it from an invasion of some sort.
But it's 16 acres.
I know.
That's a massive undertaking. So if you have invaders coming, I mean, you've got a week or two. I mean, it took them a long time to bury that thing.
They didn't have a bobcat.
Yeah, they didn't have a bobcat.
True.
Yeah. I mean, it would be a massive undertaking like building a pyramid to bury something like that. That would just take a big labor force. And then all of those people that participated in it would be taboo.
But they did say that it was intentionally buried, that it wasn't just the sands of time.
Correct, and they know that from the stratification of the remains that were found inside the buildings.
Right.
That's correct. But to bury 16 acres worth of monuments, it would take more than a week or two, and if there's a rival clan that's going to come attack you, they don't give you 6 months notice to let you know that they're going to come and you're going to bury this thing. And I think it would probably take them more than 6 months to bury it anyway.
Oh, undoubtedly. Well, how about the flood?
Here's a 5 years heads up. we're gonna come attack you in 5 years.
Well, could the Great Flood have just washed the sand over it, and it could be buried that way?
But the evidence doesn't support that.
No, that's
it doesn't
true. There's
support
no water
that
or
it was
anything.
Natural. Yeah, but there's not layering that you would see because of a natural phenomena. And it ended up becoming a hill. I mean, there was so much dirt that was put in there, and flint stuff and bones and fill material that was put into that to bury it. I mean, it's called Potbelly Hill. That the burial became a hill.
Well, it certainly is a beautiful sight. It's kind of frustrating to not know what the heck it was there for.
Yeah, the part that I find frustrating is that no one really wants to ask that question, or, try to put it in context and maybe, relook at what the timeline is. People just really want to stick with that. The Sumerians were about 4,500 BC, and they were the first culture, and they're the first ones that ever did anything. And again, sites like Göbekli Tepe take that out of the equation, and it brings to the forefront, could the Sphinx, for example, be, 7, 12, or more thousand years old, as Robert Schoch has speculated? And when you see a site like Göbekli Tepe, it says, yeah, maybe. It just gives it more ammunition that the dating that we have put on a number of these sites might not be right. And I think that scares a lot of people.
Well, they have to rewrite the history books. And they don't want to do that.
They don't want to do that.
No,
I've had people, and I've had people make the comment that, they remember in their history classes that, they talk about the Egyptians being the first civilization, and they just totally ignored the Sumerians. And it's kind of that's kind of interesting, since they had the first of everything.
But you didn't ignore them. You included the Anunnaki and some of the artwork of their culture with the giant god kings and the little I guess smaller sized people compared to the person that's represented as the elite of the culture. So there's something was going on in Sumeria that it isn't being brought up in the history books either. But maybe you ought to mark it Stepping Out of Eden as a history book for high schools.
Okay, I'm good with that, and buy lots of copies. Well, and it's interesting that the Sumerians kind of get overlooked because, according to researchers, they invented the wheel. They invented astronomy. They invented writing. They invented
wheat.
They had the first system of laws. So the laws that documented, written laws predate Moses by almost 1,000 years. So they have all of these things that we see as being the first, predating Egypt, again, by almost 1,000 years. And so, how you can just agriculture, that was in that area too. So how you can overlook them, I just find kind of remarkable. Just
okay. And some of these, since we've been talking a little bit about, if there is some kind of invading force approaching Göbekli Tepe, people may have buried it so they could go back once the war is over. There's that possibility. But in your book, you also bring up other culture clashes, like the Miles Standish types really didn't think very highly of some of the native dancing and practices going on, they really, the English colonists really missed the whole point of the drumming and the DMT. It's not like you have to give that little disclaimer out there, but they just didn't have an understanding of the true spiritual practices that were going on when they encountered them. So since we were just talking about culture clashes, you might want to talk a little bit about the difference in like these what we were kind of joking about at the beginning of the show with the gamma waves and ohm and the other earth vibrations that the Jamestown and Plymouth Colony people didn't understand.
Well, and I don't think it was the Jamestown and Plymouth Colony people per se. I mean, I think, well, in the Americas starting off, I mean, we had the Spanish that came and the conquistadors, and they didn't, understand anything that was going on. But we had a period in history where there was European expansion that happened around the globe, whether it was the Americas or later on Australia and New Zealand. And there was a mentality coming out of Europe that we're superior and they are inferior because we, quote unquote, have more technology and we're more civilized, and they're not. It's like, oh wait, but you have guns and they don't, so it became kind of one-sided that way. But with that, they would encounter these indigenous cultures, and all they could see were their differences. No one ever spent any time looking at who they were and what they believed, and no one ever looked for the similarities between the two cultures. They just looked at them as being primitive, heathen, backwater, less than human individuals that they could take advantage of. And, but what they didn't realize was that many of their beliefs, many of their traditions that they hold sacred are also held sacred in, and I'm going to say more modern religions, and I'm speaking definitely more pointedly toward Christianity. They believed in ritual purification of an infant after it's born. Oh, in Christianity, that would be baptism. They believed in, communicating with God and connecting with God, and they believed that there was an all, a creator God, now they did have multiple gods, but they did believe that there was a supreme creator being like you find in Christianity, and so there were many things that you do find in, Western religious traditions that you find in these other cultures, except it's just packaged in a different way. And in more modern Western cultures, there has been a really big separation between us as individuals and our interaction with the divine, where these people, there was a much closer interaction. In the West, it's like, it became very sanitized, and you went to church on Sunday, and that was it. And there wasn't this ongoing relationship with something bigger than themselves. It was just isolated to these things and or you sin and you're going to go to hell, and so that was the divine retribution. But if you look at the concepts and precepts and the whole package, taking a step back, the parallels between the two religious doctrines are remarkably similar. It's like, they would use herbs and fragrant woods that they would put on the fire, in order to create an aromatherapy type effect that would make you be more open to that connection with God. In church they use incense. There's just so many parallels but again, it was the way that it was packaged. But if you look even at, I posted, I've been taking quotes from the book and posting them on Facebook with like a picture behind them. So if somebody wants to find me on Facebook, it would be like Dr. Rita Louise on Facebook. And so the one that I put up today, I'm trying to remember what I put up today. Anyway, but I was sitting there, because one of the things that I talk about is finding God through chemistry. Because there are some cultures that would commune with God through an esoteric or an ecstatic experience where they would use fasting and ritual purification and then dancing and singing in order to create an ecstatic state so that they could commune with God. There are other cultures that their method to doing that might have some of those elements, and they would use some kind of hallucinogenic substance, ayahuasca, mushrooms, peyote, nicotine, whatever it was they would use to help them create that ecstatic experience. And I was going somewhere and I totally lost where that was going to be. So I guess I'll just be quiet now. Sorry. It happens sometimes.
Okay. Well, it was, we had been talking a little bit about, culture clashes, some of the, you were just talking about different ways to connect to the divine.
Mm-hmm.
Is that ringing a bell?
No, not really.
Oh.
There was definitely a point that I was getting to, and I lost it somewhere in there.
Okay.
But I'm sure in about 20 minutes it'll come back. So we can just move on.
Okay. Well, since we do both contribute articles to Ancient American Magazine, we do encounter the topic of diffusion coming up, and you do bring up that there are genetics that we've discussed in several cases so far where we're all just basically one people. We all need to take care of the little one. There's just like this genetic impulse to take care of a baby, something like that. Find shelter for ourselves. But so has that helped us to develop independently, or have these ideas just been taught by say one of these fish teachers, like the that we mentioned earlier, and that idea was went out from one source around the globe. I thought that was that topic keeps coming up in all kinds of different articles in Ancient American Magazine or Atlantis Rising. So, I want to talk a little bit about that topic.
We were talking earlier about how, the gods, taught us everything that we know, and gave us everything that we know. In my book, E.T. Chronicles, one of the things that I talk about, there's a chapter called Unnatural Selection. And I'm going to say I'll take the rap for this, that, that we didn't necessarily evolve naturally, but that we're a domesticated species. And domestication implies that there is a certain level of training that happens, as well as, and I'm going to say some genetic shifts. And I'm kind of saying that tentatively. So, for example, cows are domesticated, chickens are domesticated, horses are domesticated. And in order to, dogs are domesticated. And so in order to domesticate an animal, you have to train them. And so, we can train a lion to do tricks, but there's kind of a different thing. It's like domesticated animals, and I'm going to say, tend to be more passive in nature. One of the things that they have found through testing, and there was an experiment done by this woman with wolves. And so she took a group of wolves and kind of trained them, brought them into the fold, treated them more like dogs, you know what I mean? So they were around people all the time, and then bred them, and they noticed that there were some shifts that happened actually physiologically. Their snout became shorter, their fang teeth became smaller, and so they were shifting from having that very angular, long snout that you see on a wolf to being flatter, like you would see more on many dogs. And if you look at the evolution of humanity, at one point in time, our mouths were, I'm going to say, protruding, and I would assume that our teeth were somewhat different, and, over time our face became much flatter, and part of domestication implies that there are rules that that govern our lives. So for our dog to stay inside the house, it's like it needs to learn that it's not supposed to pee and poop in the house. That's rule number one. Don't tear up the furniture. That's a different rule. And if you don't comply with these rules, that there's going to be a punishment associated with it. So like if my dog had an accident, so let's say, in the house, all I had to do was maybe walk by it, or, sometimes I would be gone for, a really long time, and she just had to go, so she'd go by the door, and I'd come home, and she wouldn't be at the door. She'd be hiding somewhere, and then I would find it, but she already knew that she was in trouble for peeing in the house, you know what I mean? Because she had been trained. If you do that, there's going to be a punishment associated with it.
We have a caller who has a question for you. His name is Dr. Hawkins. Okay, if I bring him on?
Sure.
Dr. Hawkins, you're on.
Hello. Thank you very much. Hello, Dr. Rita. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Host. I'm doing wonderful. Thank you very much. This is
okay,
a great
so I'm just going to
show.
preface this with it's a little bit late, so I hope your question's not too super hard.
Well, actually, I just had a short comment because I think a lot of the points that you made are very profound, but perhaps may go over a lot of people's head like an umbrella. So So I sort of want to include another type of information as well. Now, what you talked about in terms of being a domesticated species is very important, and I think that really should try to grasp that. So it's sort of like being raised in human coops. For those of you that are country in nature, you'd raise chickens in a chicken coop. And if, for example, I came and let your chickens out of your coop, your food source, you would be highly upset. Maybe there was some type of ancient genetic engineering. Now, I'm not saying it happened. I'm just saying maybe. Maybe there was a type of ancient genetic engineering and manipulation of the collective consciousness which was responsible for the so-called fall of man. And with this fall of consciousness, maybe there was this group of, let's just say, entities that engineered, socially engineered us, if you will, to be docile, to only use a fragment of the mind's power and things of this nature. And I'll close with this here. Think about this. We have all of this technology, and we are still hunting each other down like animals. How much sense does that make?
It doesn't make any. But that's a great point, and I actually have commentary on that. So cool. And I wrote notes down, so maybe I won't forget what I'm talking about. And I think, there is being domesticated from an external influence. And I feel that at one point in time in our education that we were being told this is right, this is wrong, this is how you grow crops, this is how you treat each other, with the fear of divine retribution. So when you look at taboos, if you break a taboo, the fear is of divine retribution, And so if you think of your dog, and they pee or poop in the house, I could see where they could see me as divine retribution because they would get it. But your comment about the fall of consciousness, and so, this is bringing in a concept that I hope isn't too challenging. But in Indian cosmology, they talk about cycles of time, and they talk about something called the yugas. And so the yuga preceding the one we're in now was called the Dwapara Yuga, and it started about 780,000 years ago. And it was, I have to count, it was the third. So there was the first Yuga, the Seta Yuga, then the Treta Yuga, then the Dwapara Yuga, and then the Kali Yuga where we're at now. And, so the Seta Yuga, we were at our highest level of consciousness, and it was considered the golden age. And then the next Yuga, we had dropped down and lost like 25% of our level of consciousness, silver age. The Dwapara Yuga, we had dropped down, according to Indian cosmology, 50%. But what I found very interesting, because I kind of go through this timeline narrative of this is where we were. If this is the first man, what does history say, or the archaeological record or the mythic record say as we evolve through time? And so what was really interesting to me was that during this Dwapara Yuga, around 780,000 years ago, was when caste systems were put into place. So we find the different caste systems, which included the Brahma caste, who were the holders of sacred information and religious tradition. But it also included a bunch of rules and regulations. And so if we're looking at when, quote-unquote, domestication happened, where there was a series of edicts that were put into place about this is what you need to do and this is what you should do and shouldn't do. And the development of, I don't want to say a moral base, but of edicts, I think that's the best word, of this is appropriate behavior versus inappropriate behavior. It seems like that period, which again ties to a lessening of our sacred consciousness and a closer tie to the material world. And so since we couldn't navigate ourselves anymore, they had to come in with a bunch of laws and regulations to teach us to, or try to control us through something that was more mental and less spiritual, because I think people that are more spiritual in nature and are of a higher vibration are able to self-regulate better and easier because we're empathic, and we're not going to go and kill somebody because we just wouldn't do it. Period. We're not going to steal from somebody because we just wouldn't do it. So if you have to tell somebody don't steal their stuff, you've already evolved to a level of consciousness that I have to tell you, like, don't steal my stuff? Really?
Right.
But according to Indian cosmology, that whole system started to come into play about 780,000 years ago, which I find fascinating. But on the same breath, based on the level of domestication, there's them telling us what to do and giving us these laws and giving us these edicts. But now we're a well-oiled machine, and, we don't need outside sources to tell us what to do, because we have parents that tell us what to do and teachers that tell us what to do. And so we've set up this whole system of self-domestication.
That's right.
That we don't need the gods to do it anymore, because they were pretty smart. They set it up so that we would do it ourselves, to ourselves.
Very true. It's very, very true, and I pray that the people can really hear your message. I would say to the masses what my good friend Igor says all the time: listen to her with the other you. Listen with the other you.
Thank you. Thank you for your confidence in me and my work.
Thank you, Dr. Hawkins.
Thank you.
Do you have any more insights you want to provide?
Me?
Well, I do, because there's another caller if you have time.
Oh, good. Oh, okay.
Okay. This is Jay calling from Canada. You're on the air, Jay.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call.
Hi, Jay.
Hey, Rita. I just got a question regarding death and how it's actually viewed in different cultures and ancient traditions. I find that nowadays that death is never really talked about, kind of shoved under the table and not discussed, and people are lost after someone has passed on, or an animal or things like that. So, have you looked into that? What the ancients talked about death, or how they taught death when like in school, or or how it was passed on? It seems so missed and not even talked about in the modern society nowadays.
Kind of a two-part, I think, answer. It's interesting because when you look at the different gods, I'm going to use the Greek pantheon because I think people recognize the names the most readily. We have Zeus, the sky god, and we have Poseidon or Neptune, who's the god of the waters, and we have Hades, who's the god of the underworld. And when you talk about the god of the underworld, that character is never drawn on pottery. There aren't really songs or praises, or people didn't pray to the god of the underworld, but everybody knew who it was, because they knew inevitably they would be meeting the god of the underworld at some point in time. And so there was always this kind of hesitancy and scary thing kind of tied to that whole concept. Not that they didn't know about it, it's just that they didn't really talk about it. As far as death in itself as a physiological act, I feel like the general concept that you find in many cultures is in the notion of life after death. Right. You know, I mean, there are a lot that believe in reincarnation. I don't really delve into that concept in the book because I didn't want it to get too woo-woo. But, I mean, I spent a whole chapter talking about, actually I'm talking about ghosts. But you can't really talk about ghosts unless you're talking about death. And there was a huge belief that if a person didn't have a proper burial, their spirit could come back and haunt you after you're dead or after they died. And so great care was taken to ensure that the transition from life to death was a good one or an honorable one. You know, but that also implies a belief in life after death. There is a good number of cultures, not all, but a good number of cultures that practice ancestor veneration and have the belief that their ancestors can provide them with guidance, can provide them with good luck. Many times they will create a shrine to the ancestor. I mean, you see that, you know, in the Day of the Dead in South America, and you see that in Asian cultures. You know, so there is this definite belief in life after death and the connection of the living and the dead. You know, and so you don't really, well, you don't really hear stories of, like, people going to heaven, and that's kind of a lie. You know, there's a belief in many cultures that the souls of people that have passed go into the underworld because that's where you go. That's where the soul rests after death. Certain individuals were granted access to the heavens where they can become immortal like the gods. Now, this is coming very much from the mythic record. I think over time that notion was expanded, you know, from being very specific individuals who were granted passage and given immortality so that they could be godlike, like Hercules, you know, became a god and got immortality. You know, and that concept got expanded so that, you know, if you were somebody important or if you were somebody powerful, you could go to heaven. You know, the God King could go to heaven. You know, but all the rest of us, we were going with Hades. You know, that's where we were going to hang out. You know, but again, you know, I don't really know anybody that's died and come back to life, you know, and I don't really want to get into the whole near-death experience because we really don't know what's going on with them completely. You know, to report this is what's happened to them. You know, so even when you talk about death, you know, it becomes a lot of speculation because no one really knows for sure.
That's interesting. Okay. My question also is that some of the ancient traditions that should be really good for the world right now are really kind of like stuffed underneath the table or in a box somewhere. I don't know. I just wondered, feel-wise, some of those, like, I practice native traditions, and I found that they're very helpful in today's chaotic society. So I just wondered, why were they kind of like put in a little box with a little lock on it and stored away somewhere so no one can see what's going on? So I just wonder.
I mean, that's a great question. And when we're not connected to our spiritual center, I'm going to give you kind of an esoteric answer to start. So when we're not connected to our spiritual center, we tend to, one, not be grounded. And we tend to live in a world of the five senses and are controlled by input that we receive by those senses. We tend to be less, we don't go inside. You know, when traditional practices teach you about energy, they teach you about yourself, they teach you about listening to what's going on inside your body, listening to your intuition, paying attention to your gut feeling, you know, observing nature, you know, communicating with the animals, checking in with the trees. I mean, there's so much more of a connection, but that connection is an internal connection and not an external connection. You know, and this is going to be like a little kind of side note, but, you know, I had wanted to be psychic since I was 12 years old, and I read all of these books, and you would think that with all the books that I had read that I'd been, like, really freaking psychic, but I wasn't. And it took me a long time. I started taking classes at the Berkeley Psychic Institute that I finally realized that it wasn't about the external experience. It wasn't about having a deck of tarot cards. It wasn't about, you know, and memorizing the cards. It wasn't about reading all of these books. It was about the internal experience. But when we live in a five-dimensional world, we're really cut off from that internal experience. And we're not taught how to access it. We're not taught to listen to our feelings or pay attention to our feelings. You know, and so we would question authority much more. And it would make it much harder for them to control us if we were, as a people, actually following principles that come out of more traditional religious practices, I'll use.
Okay.
You know, because we would be able to think for ourselves and not just go on Facebook and repeat the headline off of an article and not even read the article, you know, and have a, you know, and create our own opinion. I mean,
yeah,
it's kind of sad, you know.
It is. Because I think creativity is lost now in a way. Some sort, it's really diminishing real quickly.
Mhm. You know, but creativity comes from, you know, and inspiration comes from us being able to turn in and connect to source. You know, when we have those aha moments, it's because we were able to contact a space that was higher than ourselves, that was more global than ourselves. You know, whether you want to call it your higher self, your cosmic consciousness, you know, whatever that plane is, you know, which is where our ancestors, in doing the rituals and dancing and singing and taking, you know, psychoactive drugs, that's where they were trying to go, to gain information and insights to bring back to share with the community around them. You know, but what I find interesting is that in doing these rituals, even if you weren't the individual who is having the ecstatic experience, because not everybody got to that place, there was still healing that happened for the entire community. So if they were hanging on to stuff, you know, emotional stuff or personal stuff, they had the opportunity to let it go and at least have a free and clear energy space. You know, and so there was this regular bouts of healing and healing energy that happened within communities that doesn't happen anymore. You know, now you just sit on your phone pushing a bunch of buttons hoping you could maybe get a person on the other side, and, you know, by the time you get that person, I mean, I don't know about you, but usually I'm pretty pissed off. And I need to, like, go meditate, but now I got to sit on the phone with these people. It's like, oh, my God. Yeah. I mean, we live in a very interesting world and very interesting times. And, you know, it just seems to be going more one way than the other way, in my opinion. Which
Yeah, I
is
find there's a lot
sad and scary.
Yeah, I find there's a lot of separateness in society nowadays. That we don't connect like we used to. But you see the stages, I don't know how old you are, Dr. Louise, but, you know, what happened when the TV came out, right before the TV came out. people used to get together and have some, talk and things like in Saturday night stuff. And then when the TV came out, we isolated ourselves within those houses, or a person had a house with a TV in it, and we go over there and watch what's going on. So, and now I think it's this technology and way we are scripted in the programming of things right now. It keeps us separated more than ever in some sort of way. So, yeah.
Exactly. Thanks for calling in.
You're very welcome, Dr. Louise. It's great talking to you. Maybe I'll talk to you again some other time. But thanks, Barbara, for letting me be part of the show.
Yeah, and
our pleasure.
Jay, since you were talking about creativity, hopefully, maybe next week we might have a couple creative people on to get more people thinking and connect to source, like Dr. Rita said. So we are working on developing that topic to reverse the trends that you were lamenting.
Oh, thank you. I just find it's really, really kind of scary out there when people have everything at the touch of a button right now, or a touch screen, and they think that's the way to go, instead of thinking they're aware of things. Or what they do is they get someone to do it for them. Unfortunately, right. I think we're getting really lazy in some ways of actually stepping forward. I think there's a lot of people are stepping back from things, not stepping forward, as in not moving forward, but just stepping up in a way, energetically, right, spiritually, or that way too. So, yeah.
Right. No, I'm agreeing with you, Jay. So we might have some creative people for next week's show. Just I hope you can tune in for that. I'm working on getting that set up. But I wanted to give Dr. Rita the last couple minutes to tell where she can get Stepping Out of Eden, watch any of her movies, any upcoming appearances. So, Dr. Rita, you can have the last couple
minutes.
Lay it
on you?
Just plug whatever you want.
I got 2 minutes. Okay. So all of my books, Stepping Out of Eden, I talked about E.T. Chronicles. I've written 3 other books. They're all available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, all of your major retailers. My videos, I have Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, as well as a film called Holy Deception, which is not really religious, but was a good title, so I used it, but I think people get scared of it. Both of those are available on Amazon.com as well. You can also purchase any of my books or gain access to the videos on Amazon or Vimeo, actually, through my website, soulhealer.com. I would really appreciate it if you were interested in purchasing one of my books, buying it directly from my website, versus going through Amazon, because they take way too much freaking money. And it's just like, God. And the added bonus is they all come signed, autographed for free from me, which is priceless.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're down to, about a half a minute mark, so it's time to say goodnight.
Thank you, Dr. Rita. Thank you, Barbara, for making the show happen. Dr. Rita, you're wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Hawkins and Jay, for calling in. It's been a great evening. Thank you, everyone.